Hey, hello everyone, and very warm welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Melissa Oliver Powell. I'm from the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York, and I'm going to be chairing the event today and the questions later. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon for what promises to be a really fantastic talk. So, on to the part you're all here for. Our speaker today is Jean Menzies. She's an ancient historian and award-winning author from Scotland. Jean writes on antiquity for both adults and children, as well as publishing fantasy under Jean Z. Menzies. Jean also runs the successful history podcast, That's Ancient History, and her very popular YouTube channel, Jean's Thoughts. Today, she's going to be talking to us about her new book from the fantastic 404 England series, All the Violet Tiaras, Queering the Greek Myths. If you don't have your copy, I'm sure we have some available afterwards. And she's going to be discussing how ancient Greek myths are being told anew by LGBTQ+ writers and readers to explore modern-day queer struggles and queer joy. I think this is going to be a fantastic talk, and there will be plenty of time for questions at the end, and Jean will be signing your books in the lobby afterwards. So Jean, over to you.
Thank you. That was lovely. Thanks so much. I was just saying that I've not been in a lecture theatre since the pandemic, so I hope I remember how to do this. All the Violet Tiaras. I don't want to completely rehash everything that's already in the book in case anybody's read it, so obviously there'll be some overlap, but I also kind of want to talk about the process of writing this and kind of what my thoughts were coming from like an academic background, but also as just like an enthusiast. Like I just love a Greek myth retelling. And we ended up calling the book All the Violet Tiaras, which for anybody who doesn't know is a line from a poem by the ancient Greek poetess Sappho. This is Mary Barnard's translation, which is the best. And in this poem, she's basically talking about this woman that she loved, but who has now gone off to get married to a man, and she's sort of saying goodbye to her and how much she'll miss her and reminiscing about the time they spent together as lovers, and the dedications they made to the goddess Aphrodite in honour of their love, including these violet tiaras they left to Aphrodite. But interestingly enough, although we have these like beautiful moments, I think, of queer history, and I'm going to use the word queer not because it's really applicable necessarily to the ancients, but because it fits with what we think of. So if I'm talking about a queer person from antiquity, I'm talking about somebody we would consider LGBTQ+ today, rather than necessarily trying to apply those labels to antiquity. But yeah, so despite having all these nice moments like this, I mean, I suppose it's nice. They don't end up together, but whatever. The Greeks actually had quite a complicated relationship with sexuality and gender in the same way that really most historical civilizations have, unfortunately. They certainly have their own concepts of what it is to be a man or a woman. They definitely have these gender constructs, I suppose, that Judith Butler would describe. They just look different from ours, and they certainly have same-sex relationships. There's examples of intersex people and trans people, but there's not the labels of gay or straight, and there's still expectations. Like, if you're a woman in ancient Greece, you don't get to spend the rest of your life with a woman. You have to marry a man. That is your sort of responsibility. Your sexuality is controlled according to how it benefits men. And then, even if you're a man who openly can have relationships with other men, which is something society did condone, there was still a lot of minutiae to that relationship about, like, depending on what kind of role in that relationship you took, whether you were civilized or submissive. So I think for all that, I think when I've talked about Greek myth retellings with people occasionally and sort of queering them, some people go, well, yeah, of course people are queering the Greek myth retelling, the Greeks were all gay. It's like, it's not as simple as that, right? History is complex, and people were dealing with their own sort of forms of discrimination, oppression in antiquity, as much as they are today, and as much as we're sort of reclaiming ancient queer narratives, we're also kind of like giving voice to them in that they've been erased at the same time. So that's just a little history lesson. But one of like my main like sort of thesis points in all of my research really is always the idea that myth is malleable. So myth is not a stagnant thing. Myth is not a defined thing. You cannot find a definitive version of a myth. You can certainly say there are versions of myths that don't exist, like that doesn't exist. But no one version of a myth is the right version, it's not the true version, and there's often a lot of different versions of myths, and that's just with even in the Greek texts themselves. If you think more broadly, really, there's a lot of crossover between Greek and Egyptian myths, Greek and Roman myths, so there's variation there too. But if you don't believe me, I just thought I'd give you some examples, because I just want to prove my point. So one of my go-to examples was one of the focuses of my PhD thesis. So I've overthought this one a lot. And I talk about it in All the Violet Tiaras. And that is the myth of Procne and Philomela, which is quite a tragic myth. It's about two sisters. And one of the sisters, Procne gets married, and then her husband, Tereus, sexually assaults her sister and cuts out her tongue so that she can't tell on him. She can't reveal what happened to him. Through weaving, Philomela is able to tell this fact to her sister Procne, and Procne and Philomela get their revenge. I don't really need to go into more detail than that, but to say that when you look at sort of the old versions of this myth, or not the old, but the oldest versions of this myth that we have referenced in plays like the fragments of Sophocles, Tereus, or in Aeschylus's plays, whenever they talk about Procne and Philomela, they talk about them as examples of madness. Look what these women did. They were mad. If you behave like them, you are mad. This terrible, terrible people. And then you look at Demosthenes' funeral speech, which was a public funeral speech given in honour of the soldiers that died at the Battle of Chaeronea in the 4th century in Athens. And he brings up Procne and Philomela, but despite the fact that all these earlier references talk about them as these mad women, he talks about them as examples of bravery and heroes who stood up to a man that did something bad to them. They are Athenians, they're Athenian princesses, and he talks about them as examples of Athenian bravery, look, Athenian citizens, you should behave like these women. And two more contrasting interpretations of a myth, I cannot think of than that. So I think that's a really important basis to sort of come at retellings with, that these myths have always been used to say whatever the person telling them wanted them to say, because neither of those versions are right. I mean, there's certainly one that I relate to a little bit more, but neither is the correct version of that myth. But they suited the purposes of the playwright who wanted to portray their characters as mad, or the political speechmaker who wanted to talk about Athenian bravery. In the same way, modern and contemporary and medieval, what have you, retailers are using the myths to portray their ideas. So that's what you're doing when you retell a myth. But it's always happened in LGBTQIA spaces too, and it's always happened. Myths have had various versions that have been queer and not queer. So, for example, I think one of the most famous myths that people think of when they try and think of a myth with queer representation is the myth of Achilles and Patroclus, being Achilles and Patroclus, the Greek heroes, who were lovers according to some sources, and not others. So in Homer's Iliad, there's no, I mean, it's not outrightly stated these guys aren't lovers, but there's no definitive evidence that he is portraying them as lovers, whereas when you get to Plato's Symposium, he talks very explicitly about Achilles and Patroclus being lovers. So I'm gonna argue today, as of this moment, that Plato is the first ever queer Greek myth retelling. So it's something that's constantly happening. And it didn't just happen in antiquity, and it doesn't just happen and then start happening now. It didn't go away. If you read the Arthurian romances, whether you're reading Thomas Malory or anonymous texts like the Post-Vulgate cycle from the 13th century, which is a French text documenting some of the Arthurian legends, including the legends of Merlin, they talk about Greek mythology. They tell myths from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and one of the myths that comes up I find fascinating, and I don't talk about this in All the Violet Tiaras because it wasn't really on point, but I think it's really interesting that they tell a version of a myth in which Diana, a goddess of chastity from ancient Rome, known as Artemis in ancient Greece, is the lover of the god Faunus, and she then takes another lover and ends up murdering Faunus because of this whole messy love triangle, which seems like completely bizarre, and in contrast with the ancient Roman idea of Diana as a virginal goddess, suddenly here she's become this goddess who's got all these boyfriends, basically. So like, you know, we've got a bit of an opposite. We've got a sort of de-queering there, asexual to like, yeah, a lot of men. So I just find all this interesting. I don't know if I'm being very articulate in my expression of that, but I think it's very interesting. This has sort of always been happening, and you can also trace like sort of queer threads throughout all of this. And a bit more of a modern example before I get into like the most modern examples is the poetry of Cavafy, who was a 20th century Greek poet who looked to the myths of his country to help him express his love for his lover and the man that he was in love with, who he then compares to Eros in his poem. So I think, like, for all that I would say that there's sort of a heyday of queer Greek myth retellings today, probably because there's like a heyday of queer literature and a wonderful, although plenty of struggles still to happen, like there's definitely moves to have more queer literature on the shelves and in the bookshelves are being published. It's been happening for a while. Like, we've always existed, we know that, and we've always been, you know, slipping through the cracks and using Greek myth to do that and to share our existence. So I thought that was relevant. But yeah, so one of the things I just do in my spare time when I have nothing better to do is I collect a database of Greek myth retellings. Like, they don't have to be LGBTQIA+, they're just any and all Greek myth and Roman myth retellings as well. They're all classical myth retellings because I just find it interesting. And sometimes I just sit there and I like scroll through this database and think, what myths are retold more than any others? And it's interesting. Like, I don't know if anybody could guess, but funnily enough, the Trojan War is probably the most retold story as far as I can tell. But then I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today, and I was thinking about something that I think comes through in the book, but I didn't explicitly state in the book, is that there are certainly some myths that, from what I'm reading, LGBTQIA authors gravitate towards and find use in order to tell stories. So these are the ones that I don't want to say this is an exhaustive list, because, you know, again, I'd probably just do this in my bed when I'm bored. But from what I could tell, these are the myths that the greatest number of queer myth retellings exist within. There's lots of other myths that are being retold as well, but these are the ones that have like got multiple. More than anything else, Orpheus and Eurydice is the winner. But you know, there's quite a few Artemises, there's quite a few Tiresiases, loads of Hades and Persephones, and I think that's really interesting. Particularly with Orpheus and Eurydice being like the most popular myth that I can ascertain. And I actually talk about 3 different Orpheus and Eurydice myth retellings in this book because there's so many of them and they all do such interesting things. When in some senses, in isolation, the myth is pretty heteronormative. It's a love story between a man and a woman. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are both straight by our definitions, but in that sense, the myth is quite heteronormative. So I thought I would take it as a sort of case study as why somebody might want to explore their experiences and their relationship with sexuality and gender through a myth that doesn't necessarily make itself obvious for this purpose. You know, it's not necessarily explicitly queer to begin with, whereas, like, you know, it makes sense that Tiresias gets retold often because it's a myth about a man who becomes a woman who becomes a man. So you've got the exploration of gender sort of set out for you there, or Artemis again, who can be seen as sort of like an ace or aromantic champion, or by others because she spends a lot of time with women as a queer woman, lesbian, bisexual, well, probably not bisexual because she's never interested in men, but those ones make sense, right? Not the others don't make sense, but those ones seem more obvious, whereas Orpheus and Eurydice, like, you wonder why, and there's all these books doing it in such interesting ways, and I think they're so good. Like, more than anything, I think you should read these books after this talk if you haven't, because they're just phenomenal. And like for the ones I talk about in the book are not the only ones that I've noticed do this, but they're the ones I talked about in the book, because there's 3 really different books, but they all use Orpheus and Eurydice as a structure for their storyline. So Orpheus and Eurydice, if you don't know the myth, is about 2 young lovers. Orpheus and Eurydice, who recently get married. Eurydice goes into the woods and gets bitten by a snake and dies. Orpheus is obviously devastated. he roams the forest, playing his musical instrument, singing his song, pining after the women he loves, to the point where literally like flowers are dying because they're just so sad for him. And he gets this opportunity to go down because of his music and his grief to the underworld and save Eurydice. But when they are returning to the land of the living, Orpheus forgets the one warning he was given by the goddess of death, which is don't turn around and look behind you, and right at the last minute he does. Sees Eurydice behind him, but he's broken the spell and she has to go back to the underworld. So it's quite a tragic tale. And you might think that's quite a depressing myth to choose as sort of one to retell a lot, but people do it in such interesting ways. So like, Orpheus Girl is a contemporary young adult book, so it's aimed predominantly at teenagers and older. Set in the contemporary day, it's set in the USA, and it's about two young girls who have recently sort of come out to each other as being lesbian. They've not told other people because they're from a really religious community and they wouldn't be safe. And when it does come out, they both get sent to a Pray the Gay Away camp, which unfortunately is something that still happens. And Midnight and Apollo is a superhero comic. It's a DC superhero comic about two superheroes who are actually, I didn't know this until I was writing this book, the first ever mainstream comic book couple who were gay to get married in a comic book, which I thought was pretty cool. But yeah, so we've got superhero comic book, YA, contemporary novel, and then The Song of Us is actually a middle grade book, so it's aimed at children, and it's about two sort of girls at the very, I mean, again, they're in a US high school, and I don't fully understand the system, but sort of around 13, so kind of at the very beginning of secondary school in the UK, who are finding love for the first time. And it's told in verse, so very much in honour of the ancient Greeks, and how they originally told their myths in written form and orally. So really different things. And I thought, well, there's obviously something about this myth that people are being drawn to, and you might be able to like make the leaps yourself. But these were some of the themes that I was sort of noticing that people were finding representation for in the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, because obviously it's a story of doomed lovers, and unfortunately in the history of being LGBTQIA+, there's lots of tragic love stories, and there's lots of couples who were never able to be together, who had to hide their love, and we all know that. So there's that sort of relation to the sadness of our history. Then there's the fight for love, that will to fight for being able to love the person you love and to have them with you, the Orpheus and Eurydice experience, even though in the original myth it doesn't necessarily work out. Although they end up together eventually when Orpheus dies too. And he goes to the underworld, so but there's that sort of like that hope really for that fight for love. You don't know how it's going to end, and I will say, don't make any assumptions on those books I mentioned about how they end. They all do different interesting things. So there's that hope, as well as the queer grief, and that like very specific grief that you understand about if society, even if it's just like the home you come from, or it's the school you go to, or the community you're a part of, or the literal laws of the country you're in, telling you that you cannot be with the person you love, you cannot express your love for that person. And also just the ability to self-express, to express your identity loudly and proudly, and to feel all of that. And those, for me, feel like the themes. When I think about it like that, when I think about those themes and how they relate to Orpheus and Eurydice, I'm like, actually it makes complete sense that everybody is retelling Orpheus and Eurydice with LGBTQIA themes. Like, honestly, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you pick any other myth? This is the myth, clearly. And I just want to come back to Orpheus Girl, because I feel like it does it in one of the most self-aware ways, and the way that Orpheus and Eurydice is used, and actually just Greek mythology in general is used in Orpheus Girl, I think is basically like the best case study and example of how Greek myth can be used. Not like to argue this book is better than the others, but like it's a very self-aware way of doing it, that it's almost like a study of how you use Greek myth in itself. I'll explain. So what I find really interesting is this is a contemporary novel, so it's not set in ancient Greece. These are not Orpheus and Eurydice. These are two young women in the USA, two teenagers. They are not the characters, they are not in ancient Greece. But the protagonist who narrates the story is into Greek mythology, as I'm sure a lot of us are here. She really likes Greek mythology. So in the same way that say, when you pick up a Greek myth retelling, or when you sit down to write your own Greek myth retellings, or when authors sit down to write Greek myth retellings, she actually uses that to explore her own emotions from a safe distance. So when her partner, when her girlfriend is taken from her and sent to this camp, that she's eventually then sent to as well, she actively, in the narration, positions herself as Orpheus. She's like, I'm going to be Orpheus. I'm going to go to this camp and I'm going to save my girlfriend from the underworld, which is this camp. She very much ignores the ending of that myth, but she sees herself as an Orpheus, and she explicitly states that to you as the reader. So you see the way that she's using it as a coping mechanism, because while she's Orpheus, she doesn't have to be herself. She can be this mythological, otherworldly character who has survived in memory for thousands and thousands of years, who could talk to the gods and could potentially save their lover. And she does it again and again throughout the book, and not just with that myth. She also relates to being Sisyphus while she's at the camp, how Sisyphus would have to push the rock up and it would roll back down every single day. She also is forced to move rocks as a horrible sort of torture that they're put through at this camp, and she talks about, I am Sisyphus. Or when she wants to leave the camp and one of the guards is sort of like, well, one of the teachers is sort of circling at night time the camp to make sure no kids are escaping. She refers to her as Cerberus, the dog that guards the underworld. So she's very explicitly stating that Greek myth helps her cope, and Greek myth helps her understand her experience as this timeless experience. And I think that, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't want to claim anything too grand, but like for me, that's what it feels like we're doing when we retell a Greek myth in general, and specifically in this case, as an LGBTQIA person to an LGBTQIA audience, but LGBTQIA stories, is we're sort of, we're sort of placing our story in this sort of timeless, endless journey of stories where we can relate to these figures that have always existed, and use the myths in the same way that Demosthenes really did back in the 4th century to kind of tell our version of things. But that's obviously a myth that, like I said, you could argue sort of in isolation pretty heteronormative, and that's an example of how we can use Greek myth to kind of look inside ourselves, and that can then relate to other people, but it's quite like a personal or like small group experience. Whereas I think one of my other favourite examples in the book, and as a book, to talk about here is actually on a much like bigger, almost political level, what a queer Greek myth retelling can offer to society, with the example of Hercules. So Hercules is his Roman name, or Heracles as he's known in Greece. So I'm just going to say Hercules mainly because most reception says Hercules. So if I'm referring to any reception of him, they will have called him Hercules, so I'm just going to call him Hercules. But please know that he was called Heracles in ancient Greece. Like most people in this room have probably heard the name Hercules, right? Like Hercules, I don't have any proof of this, but I swear has to be one of the most well-known people of ancient Greek mythology. You know, he's in Disney, he was played by Arnold Schwarzenegger and The Rock, and there was a few years ago, when I was at university, I think, where literally there was 2 films in the same year that came out about Hercules. I grew up watching The Legendary Journeys, and there's statues, he's really just everywhere. Like, I am sure of this, and someone's probably done a study on this. Like, he has got to be one of the most well-known figures of mythology. Yet, despite his popularity in pop culture, in Disney films, in Hollywood blockbusters, in TV shows, he's not the queerest of characters in these receptions. He is more often than not actually an example of quite a hyper-masculine person, like a sort of an idea of hyper-masculinity, which is much more modern. Because of course he was also sort of the peak of masculinity in antiquity, but their idea of that was different, because obviously we know that the ancient Greeks were very like okay with men sleeping with men, with caveats. But he's often just portrayed as having relationships with women, and I don't remember a single episode of Hercules' Legendary Journeys or any of these movies where Hercules is portrayed as queer. Yet, in the ancient Greek myths, Hercules has a lot of famous relationships with men in addition to women. You know, he may have married Megara and Deianira, but he also, ran around in desperate panic trying to save his lover Hylas when he was abducted by nymphs. Like, he loved fiercely men and women. And despite that, he, in the 20th century in particular, and I'd say in the early 21st century, was predominantly portrayed as quite a straight character. I don't think he was going around stating the sexuality in these books, and there's more than just that's more than just annoying to me as an ancient history. That actually can have like serious implications, because we're not the only people retelling Greek myths. Like, queer people are not the only people retelling Greek myths or claiming Greek myths. There are also groups who would wish the queer community harm that are also claiming Greek myths. Among sort of contemporary alt-right groups, among sort of red pill, manosphere, incel groups, whatever. Basically, far-right, alt-right groups that believe, women should be at home in the kitchen, only men and women should have relationships that are sexist, that are homophobic, that are racist, and everything else like that. Under the sun, they love classics. And they're constantly using and abusing this discipline, which unfortunately has traditionally had quite an association with an elite male white audience. And there are so there's this phenomenal book called Not All Dead White Men, which is written by Donna Zuckerberg, who's a classicist, and the sister of Mark Zuckerberg, randomly, called Not All Dead White Men, Classics and Misogyny in the Digital Age. And she looks at how these groups of these alt-right incel groups online are using Greek and Roman mythology, Greek and Roman history to sort of bolster their views. They give themselves a sense of legitimacy, right, by saying, well, the ancient Greeks did this, they're the peak of civilization and society. They're either using bad examples or misappropriating examples to bolster their worldview. And there are examples of sort of pro-Trump, far-right rallies in the US where they have big pictures of statues of Hercules that say things like, protect our heritage. And these are the same men, it is predominantly men in these communities, who are very outrightly homophobic. So in Donna Zuckerberg's book, one of the quotes she used, her words are better than mine, she says is that a nuanced view of sexuality and gender expression is anathema to the red pill community. The only accepted modes of self-expression are heterosexual masculine man and heterosexual feminine woman. So they don't admit to the diverse spectrum of sexuality and gender expression and identity that exist. And they are using the Greek myths as part of their proof of this and part of their, to bolster this idea. So when I read Herc, which came out last year, it literally came out not long before this book came out, and I was really glad that the publishers sent me an early copy of it because it was just perfect. This book, which isn't trying to pretend that Hercules was a phenomenal person, he does some pretty bad stuff in mythology, as with most mythological figures. But what he is a man who loved men and women, and you see those relationships depicted on the page. So it was so sort of uplifting for me to have a book do that was, going to be in Waterstones. I'm not saying that this is going to get in the hands of a bunch of alt-right incels and sort of change their minds, but we need to sort of almost be re-queering the myths as much as queering them. So as much as maybe the Orpheus and Eurydice story versions could be called a queering of the myth, if anything, Herc is more accurate to the originals than anything that has come out in the past 100 years has been, aside from Autobiography of Red, which also has a queer Heracles in it. So in doing that, it's actually quite revolutionary and radical, and I genuinely think I'm better at writing than I am at speaking, so I'm just going to read something that I wrote in this. So Zuckerberg notes that accusations of homosexuality are commonly used as insults on gay message boards. I don't need to tell you that there exists a strong sense of homophobia and transphobia among such communities, but these are also the same people posting pictures of Trojan Prince Hector with the words protect, provide, procreate. This is what peak masculinity looks like online in support of traditional gender roles. They are also the same people producing posters featuring Hercules that read protect your heritage as part of wider white supremacist campaigns on college campuses. And they are the same people, including pictures of Brad Pitt's Achilles in a bizarre anti-LGBTQIA plus video supposed to depict the ideal man posted on behalf of the US politician Ron DeSantis. So it's quite a radical thing to also re-queer a myth that has been so very much straight-washed, I think, is fair to say. But then I also just wanted to share something else from writing this book, which was I got to talk to some readers and some reviewers and some writers and interview them, because as much as I can sit down and overanalyze a bunch of books, it was important to me to understand what other people took away from these books and what authors were trying to communicate with these books and what it meant to them to write them. And I think like this selection of quotes right here sort of perfectly summarizes kind of the end goal of LGBTQIA retellings of Greek myth, that they give a sense of belonging to readers. It means that they can see themselves throughout history and mythology, and in this quite transcendent experience, as Bea says. For writers like Kate Fussner, it feels like it allows them to honour the true universality of myths, because to portray them as quite straightforward, limited, precise things is incorrect, really. Amy Hines-Scott is a phenomenal scholar who's working on classical receptions as her PhD, and she said that queer retellings approach the connections between people with a tenderness that I find lacking in many non-queer receptions. And when she said that, it kind of opened my eyes as well, because I don't think I'd really thought about that either. There is a tenderness in these stories in the way they're being retold by authors and exploring queer narratives. And I think it's because it's so personal. So one of the other books I talked about and I read is a book called Goddess of the Hunt by Shelby Eileen, which is a collection of poems told from the perspective of the goddess Artemis. And the author is aromantic and asexual, and she sees herself in Artemis, and she explored her experiences coming out as ace and understanding her identity as ace through Artemis, and she was able to voice her experiences through Artemis when Artemis talks to Aphrodite and asks, you know, everybody else is falling in love with people. It's not that I want to, but shouldn't I be? Like, that's what everyone else is doing. And Aphrodite validates her, and Aphrodite says that, you know, your love might not be sexual or romantic, and you might not want a relationship, but like, that doesn't mean you're not as important to me as a goddess of love. And what I think is really important there is that, and in the same example of Orpheus Girl, is that sometimes it can be really hard to explore your own complicated feelings with sexuality and gender when you've been raised in a society that maybe isn't always as inclusive or as accepting as we'd like it to be. When you can imagine that an ancient goddess or an ancient god or somebody with so much power that is still considered important and incredible and retold today as having experienced something akin to what you experience, it really does make you feel seen and belonging, and it really does help you remember that you're not alone, and that, you know, this is a transcendent experience, and that queer people have always been here, and they may have been shut away and dismissed, but they have always existed in myth and history, and in retelling these stories, we're reclaiming that, and I think that's something really wonderful and important, and I'm so grateful to everybody that wrote a book that meant that I could read it and analyse it and write another book about it. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean. I think it was a fascinating talk, covering so much just in 40 minutes.
Well, it's hard, isn't it? I did one, I was like, maybe I should just read the book I liked, because it's quite short, maybe, but I don't think I would have needed more than 40 minutes.
I mean, there's some wonderful quotes in it.
Yeah.
The one you just said with the Aphrodite speaking to,
isn't
it something like, you're a whole goddess?
Yes, you are still a whole goddess. I've got the book. I had so many more quotes from the original text in the original copy of the book, and I now just have a massive document on my computer full of beautiful quotes that make me feel really nice and happy to look at. But there was some really good ones for Artemis, and I don't know how to find it, but yeah.
I think hopefully we can all leave feeling like whole goddesses.
Yeah.
So we have about 20, a little bit over 20 minutes now actually for audience questions. I think we already have one raring to go with that.
Okay.
So I think we've got roving mics just to let everyone know, so I'll just call on people as they come up. But,
you said that the most queerified of all of the myths was the Orpheus myth. It's one that I've definitely heard it before at some point, but I don't understand really why it became, because you know, with the Hercules myths, there was the myth that, you know, that he liked men was already there, was in the contemporary literature of the day when it was originally written.
Yeah.
I don't really see that in the Orpheus myth. Like you said, it presents itself as very heteronormative.
Yeah.
So why do you think that has become? I mean, I think you sort of answered this, but maybe a bit more of a nuanced answer is why that became so queerified in subsequent history.
Well, I think something else that's interesting actually. So Herc, the more recent retelling of Hercules, is a book that is set in antiquity. So there's like different types of myth retellings, right? If you've read some, you'll know. In my head, there's sort of two main categories, which are the ones that are set in antiquity, you're following the ancient characters, and then there's the ones which are modern reinterpretations inspired by the story. Maybe like Frankenstein is a modern Prometheus. So what's interesting about all the Orpheus and Eurydice ones is that they are all almost exclusively modern retellings. There is one I can think, I don't have it up there, but that I remember that is still ancient, but they're almost exclusively modern. So they're never explicitly about Orpheus and Eurydice, so they're never, not that I think this would be a problem if they did, but they're never taking Orpheus and Eurydice, the figures of mythology, and making them both women, or making them both men, or in some other way queering it. They're always just taking the experience of those two people as a sort of tragic, separated love story, but that's been so well remembered and so well loved and related to, and applying it to sort of more modern couples. And I think, like, I mean, obviously it's hard to really ever understand why a trend is like, it could just be that one person did it and lots of people read it and thought it was a good idea, so they did it too. But I think like that's an important factor when you think about it, is that it's less about the characters and the myth, and it's more about the themes of that myth, as opposed to Heracles, who could represent this awesome like bi or pan character from antiquity. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Oh. I was just wondering about the Orpheus thing, if potentially part of it is Orpheus is not, through a modern lens, a very masculine character. Like, the way that he goes about trying to save, I don't know how to pronounce it, Eurydice?
Eurydice, I mean, there's no ancient Greeks here to correct you.
Like he's not slaying a monster, for example, like and like his musical prowess as well. It seems very sort of like, it reads as queer even though he is a straight man.
Yeah, there's like a softness and a tenderness, and as opposed to maybe somebody like Hercules whose battles are all about him killing, and in some ways Hercules' relationships with women are as much about status, and sort of his status is marrying a princess, for example, whereas like Orpheus and Eurydice, it feels like a genuine love story. You know, he doesn't just want to get Eurydice back because it validates his position as king of Sparta, like Menelaus with Helen. He genuinely loves her, and he expresses his grief, which, as you said, is traditionally not seen as something that men are allowed to do. So I think, yeah, in that sense, absolutely, I think that's a really good reading of it.
Sorry, am I allowed to ask a question?
Okay.
Is it, do you think that people are still, I'm just trying to think of how to word this in a way that makes sense to everyone and not just in my brain. Do you think that these stories are, you know, so adaptable, but especially to sort of groups that don't have maybe as much of a voice historically because of, you know, these characters have over time become these like kind of overly caricatured, you know, like, and so they are quite impressionable. So I'm just thinking of like going back to the DC heroes, they're all based on the gods of old, like you've got the Flash and Superman and all that kind of stuff. So you can kind of imprint a lot of, because they are so quite, it's not like they went, you know, dear diary, today I went and fought a lion. Do you know what I mean? It's like, and I think as well, you know, potentially there's no, you know, obviously in ancient Greek, the dynamics were a lot more balanced. I think obviously the women had the more domestic time, but I think there's quite a lot of feminist retellings as well at this that are coming through.
That's another big theme in the retellings, absolutely.
And so, you know, I'm just wondering if that's kind of a link towards their popularity, is that people are sort of seeing a more, it's not quite, you know, it was a bit more free than it was.
Like, I wonder if, like, this is relevant to what you're saying, in that, like, one of my interpretations is that, well, for a long time, classics was quite an elite subject, right, that was, like, taught and studied by quite an elite subset of people. And in regard to, like, the feminist retellings, like, something in the early study of classics and all of the writing about ancient Greece is almost like women were a footnote, as if they weren't there, because, you know, they don't have all their books, so, like, they basically weren't there. And, like, then in, like, the 70s, with the, like, part of the feminist movement also impinged on, like, history, impinged sounds bad, but, like, impacted history as well, because you get feminist approaches to history, and then, in a way, the sort of modern Greek myth retellings that are feminist takes are sort of part of that journey of going, like, sort of undoing some of that bad work, or not bad work, but that ignoring of women. Like, when I was doing my PhD, it was about, it was about sexual assault, and it was about women. But, like, part of me was just like, why has nobody written about this before? And I'm like, well, to be honest, it's not been written about before because it's about women. And unfortunately, that is just the fact of it. Like, everyone just wanted to keep writing about the same two guys. Like, how many, like, no offense to Nero, but, like, how many books can there be about him when it's, like, so in the same way that, like, sort of, in some ways, there was periods in which there was, like, a real attempt to erase the queer parts of ancient history too. So I think, like, as much as they occupy, like, a modern space for us that can be quite liberating, they also, as retellings, occupy, like, I think, a place in the study of history and the discipline of history and sort of correcting some of that crap. Yeah, I don't know if that made sense. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Thank you. I was wondering, of the database you put together, all the different myth retellings, if there's a myth that you thought, why has nobody touched this yet, or something that you would want to retell yourself, a particular myth that's been a bit abandoned?
I feel like I do write children's books about Greek myths. I don't know if I'll ever write a Greek myth retelling, but there's definitely some that I would love to see other people retell and love to read. And actually, until recently, I was like, why are not more people, and not even necessarily as LGBTQIA retellings, I was like, why are there not more retellings of Eros and Psyche? Because it's, like, actually quite a nice story, which is quite rare. But there was one that came out last year, it's very good. But one of the ones that I sort of was thinking about when I was writing that book is, like, why is there not a retelling, whether it's in antiquity or modern day, about, like, a queer Aphrodite? Like, she's the goddess of love. Like, if we're going to write about love and queer love, she's relevant. And interestingly enough, there's, like, two sides to that coin of Aphrodite doesn't have any myths where she has relationships with women. She's not necessarily ever portrayed as anything but a heteronormative woman, but, like, those labels obviously don't necessarily apply in antiquity, but you don't have examples of that. But with things like the Sappho poem, you can see that there were women relating their love of women to Aphrodite. So if somebody would go home and write that, I would really like to read it. And if Aphrodite was a romance author, that would be even better. That I would really like to read about. Yeah.
I think you pitched that in your book, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I was like, please, somebody
sort of Bob
write
Cartman
it.
thing, yeah.
It's not for me to write, but I would love to read somebody else's version of that. Do you have something here?
As wondering why you think it's primarily the Greek stories that are getting retold and not stuff from, like, Mesopotamia or the Norse?
So I think it's, like, twofold. There's the, like, boring fact of they are just some of the most well-documented myths. The Greeks, to put it bluntly, just loved writing things down. And a lot of it survives and has been like, but then it's not just that they were written down in the first place, it's the fact that they have been so popular in Europe for such a long time that they've continuously been rewritten down and retranslated and retold. I mean, like Shakespeare and like with the Arthurian stuff, that they have become a very ingrained part of, I would say, like all of European culture. And like, I think it's important as well to think about the fact that like Greek myths, ancient Greece wasn't necessarily just Greece the country, you know, like Macedonians and Romanian, like modern day Romania and Asia Minor shared similar and if not the same myths and the same gods and goddesses, so they were already quite widespread to begin with. And then Alexander went around the world going, these are my myths, have them. And you know, we always had a relationship. I think as Europe with like trade routes and stuff like that, you get like, there's literally like Mycenaean artifacts that have been found in Britain, so like 3,000 years old. So there's like always been relationships there. And then I also just think there's that concept of mythical syncretism, and I'm never sure if I'm saying that right, in that although we use the Greek names, are they just retellings of Greek myths? Because there's so much overlap, right? Like with the Greeks would have been influenced by the Mesopotamians and the Assyrians, so some of their myths are very similar.
He came from Ishtarte, from
Mesopotamia.
Yeah.
Or like they both have flood myths, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and then you've got the Great Flood with Deucalion. And so like, although we use the Greek names, I would say I'm going to suggest that the Greek names are simply because of how well recorded they are and how popular they've remained. But in a way, are they just retellings of Greek myths, or are they just more retellings of mythological themes?
Like how Romans took the names, took the gods of where they lived and just gave them the Roman names.
Yeah, exactly. So like a retelling about Athena is also a retelling about Minerva, really, isn't it? In that sense. Yeah, I think so. But I do think there's more people retelling other myths, which is really exciting. I've noticed more East Asian myth retellings coming out, which is really exciting, and I would like to read more of those.
Do you have any book recommendations, especially about maybe gender?
Mm-hmm, yeah, so obviously I only had like a couple of case studies there. One of, if not my favourite, I hate to play favourites, but I think my favourite Greek myth retelling of all time is Hold Your Own by Kay Tempest. Have you read that one? No, okay, good, so that's a new recommendation. So it's a poetry collection, but even if you're not into poetry or haven't read much poetry before, I find it a very accessible collection. And you can actually watch videos of Kay Tempest performing it on YouTube if you'd rather experience it as spoken word. And it's a retelling of the story of Tiresias. And Tiresias in mythology was a man who got, does Greek mythology make sense? He split up two snakes and turned into a woman. And then he lives as a woman. Well, then she lives as a woman for years, and then again becomes a man again. And Kay Tempest uses that structure to explicitly explore gender in the collection. And Kay Tempest is a non-binary writer, so like part of their experience is in that poetry collection. And then so one of the ones I talked about in here is by an author who I know has a novel that's also about a trans character, but I haven't read the novel yet. But she wrote a short story, which I talk about in here, which is about the Amazons, and the idea that the Amazons would also have been would have included trans women. Maya Dean. So I haven't read her novel, but it's also, I know, a trans retelling. And then, what else was there? Now I'm like, I wrote this like a year ago, and I'm trying to remember. Hold Your Own is like the best book ever written, as far as I'm concerned. There's also, actually, Variations on an Apple by Yoon-Ha Lee is free online to read because it's a Tor original, so it's on Tor's website, and it's a gender-fluid version of the Trojan War, where Paris gifts the apple not to Aphrodite, but the person who he loves, who's gender-fluid, so he loves them in all forms and thinks they're the most beautiful person, so like I think there's some nice exploration in that one as well. Yeah.
Hello again.
Thank you.
Very early on, you mentioned that the real sort of queer experience, especially in ye olden Greek days, is one of tragedy, right? That people don't get to stay together.
Yes.
And maybe that's more so true of the women than it is of the men.
Yeah.
But I'm going to confess my own ignorance that I don't actually know a lot about Sappho. But how did she get away with it in a way that so few women in that era did manage to?
So I think Sappho is such an interesting figure because everyone has so many different opinions. There has been many different interpretations of Sappho over the year. We don't know very much about Sappho's life. We literally know what is in her poems, and those are pretty fragmentary. What we know is that she writes love poems, and those love poems include poems to men and women. So we don't actually, we can't really make bold claims, although Sapphic has become a term that... And I don't know why I didn't talk about this, but I think it's so interesting that we use ancient Greek words to refer to literature which is queer, like Sapphic and Achillean, which I think is really interesting. But obviously Sapphic has come to represent women who love women, or women who love women and non-binary people. And but Sappho may have, and may have had a husband, as far as we can tell. Whether that's because she was madly in love with him or just because it was expected of her, I really couldn't tell you. So yeah, who knows? There might be loads of women who were also having sex with their pals, right? And had female lovers whilst also having a husband, but they weren't writing poetry about it. So their husbands weren't writing it down, so we don't know about it.
Every nunnery in Europe was a front.
Yeah, exactly. But there's loads of priestesses. Maybe that's what they were doing. That's the thing, isn't it? And there's this unfortunate reality of sometimes you can speculate, and there might never be proof of something, at least in my lifetime, of certain things. But I guess because Sappho's so iconic, because she wrote down her love of women, it's such a long time ago, that's why she's such a bastion of women who love women. But she did write love poetry to men as well, so maybe she was a bicon. I'll claim that, that's great for me. But yeah, it's hard to know. But yeah, that's the thing. I think I don't want to say, it was a patriarchal society, so women definitely had the harder end of the stick, I think, a lot of the time. Yeah. Sucks.
I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the myth that you focused on in your thesis for your PhD, because you mentioned it in your book and then you mentioned it very early on, but I found it really interesting because it's not the only rape story, of course, that you can find in Greek mythology, but it sort of resonated with me a bit, it really... so yeah, if you can tell us a bit more about it.
So this is my pet obsession, right? Procne and Philomela. And the reason I became obsessed with it was because of Demosthenes' funeral speech, because I started off being obsessed with court speeches. So I love, if you get bored of myths, read some court speeches. They're really interesting, insights into life. And I read this part of Demosthenes' speech and was quite struck by how it used women as a bastion of bravery, which is quite a rare thing. And then I became obsessed with the myth in itself. It's actually a myth that inspired Titus Andronicus by Shakespeare as well. So one of the longest versions of the myth that exists is in Ovid's Metamorphosis. And then Titus Andronicus is a horrific play. The original myth was brutal, and that play makes it worse. It is horrific. But one of the things that the character does in it is gets her copy of Ovid's Metamorphosis out to be this is what's happened to me. But I find it really interesting. So one of the things I talked about in my thesis is so the sexual assault aspect of it may not have been in the original version, but some of the longer original versions, did I say that they turn into birds at the end? I don't think I did. They turn into birds at the end. So because they're punished to turn into birds, which is meant to be the ultimate sort of away from the civilized world of humans, and now they're birds. There's a different myth about how someone became a nightingale before, and it seems more about sister jealousy and not necessarily about sexual assault. And it's as they become more sympathetic, the sexual assault gets introduced, and then finally they become these brave bastions. But the reason I talked about it in my PhD thesis is because one of my arguments was that part of the Athenian concept of their identity. And I'm not saying that they necessarily upheld this on a personal level in what was happening in society, but how they positioned themselves on this is our national identity, and this is what we do, is that we defend women against sexual assault, and you should support us in the war because those other people will sexually assault your women. And what I find that really interesting. I might have just gone off on a complete tangent. I found it really interesting that part of the Athenian democratic identity was that they were proposing that they were defenders of women against sexual assault, and that was why Demosthenes used this example. So he was like, look, these women punished a man for sexually assaulting them, you should go to war and defend women from being sexually assaulted. But yeah, I'm trying to think, I think the longest version is probably Ovid's Metamorphoses, because before that it's a lot of fragments that you're piecing together rather than a full version. So I'd say Ovid's Metamorphoses is probably the best place to read it. Yeah. There was a whole play that Sophocles wrote about it, and we only have 5 fragments, and it's really upsetting, so we have to guess what he was saying.
I think that's actually one we're running to the end of time. It's an interesting place to end on Philomena.
You can read my PhD thesis online.
But it's, because the thing that you brought it up in your talk, and it happens in Titus Andronicus as well, is that they suffer, but they adapt and they find new ways to tell with the weaving and
but then because they take away her hands in Titus Andronicus, she can't weave.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
But she writes with her feet instead.
And grabs of it.
And it leads to these kind of transformations, the sort of remaking of the body on your own form and the remaking of language and how you speak, and that's really, I think, what the spirit of the book and these queer retellings sort of is.
That's nice. I like that.
So I think we might have time for, if anyone's got any burning some quick questions, we might have time for one more.
Everyone wants to go to bed.
Or to go to bed. But on that note, I think we'll say again, thank you so much and just to say thank you as well to the audience and all of your wonderful questions and seeing just so much joy and passion here as well.
What your questions are great. I think I could have just done an hour of questions with you guys. Then you get to talk about what people actually want to hear about.
Next year, perhaps, or on your channel. I'm sure if you've been inspired to read more of the wonderful, and I love this.
Oh my god, the design! I love it, and I think it's got quite an androgynous feeling, which I quite like.
I was wondering why the violet tiara is put on the slightly mask-coded.
Yeah, they just sent it to me, and I was like, oh my god, that's it.
So we do have copies available from our independent bookseller, Fox Lane book. Jean will be there signing the books as well, and I think probably chatting a bit more about classics.
I'd love to chat about it.
So thank you again so much for attending the event.
Thank you.